Hey everyone, it's Eric with Pure Pressure and Pure Labs. Thanks for tuning into our webinar. Unfortunately, we ran into a couple technical errors which prevented some of the slides from being seen completely. So you're going to notice a couple text boxes that got cut off, and unfortunately the final slide covering some of the common mistakes wasn't able to be put in until the last minute. But all the content is there, and we're really excited to share this with you. Just as a quick reminder, you can download the full PDF of this presentation, which is linked in the description below. Thanks for tuning in, and we hope you enjoy.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's live broadcast, Solventless Lab Buildouts, Setting Up for Success. I'm Megan LaRue, the Group Editorial Director of Cannabis Science and Technology, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. We are pleased to bring you this webcast presented by Cannabis Science and Technology and sponsored by Pure Pressure. I would now like to share a statement from our sponsor. Pure Pressure is a 100% employee-owned, USA-based manufacturer of all manner of solventless processing equipment, including rosin presses, hash washing vessels, rosin filter bags, and more. Pure Pressure believes that solventless cannabis concentrates are a benefit to society and the economy. This core belief drives their team's dedicated and uncompromising efforts to engineer the world's very best solventless processing equipment. I have a few important announcements before we begin. This webcast is designed to be interactive, and we encourage you to ask questions during the event. You can submit questions by typing them in the Q&A box, which can be found on the right-hand side of your screen. You can enlarge the slide window by clicking on the small square icon in the upper right-hand corner of the slide window, or by hovering your mouse over the lower right-hand corner and dragging the window to the desired size. The slides will advance automatically during the event. If you have any technical problems viewing or hearing this presentation, please click on the question mark help widget in the dock at the bottom of your presentation window. I would now like to introduce today's speaker. We are pleased to be joined today by Eric Volosky. Unfortunately, Allie Britton could not be with us today, but Eric will present the information she prepared. Eric Volosky is the Director of Marketing and Business Development for Pure Pressure, the world's #1 solventless equipment and technology provider. As a premier speaker and solventless expert, Eric has worked in the cannabis space for the last 7 years. Eric is passionate about cannabis education, brand building, and marketing. Thank you for joining us today, Eric. Please get us started.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Super excited to be sharing this information with you all. And we've got a lot to go over. I'm going to be leaving around 15 minutes for Q&A at the end, so don't be shy about asking questions. And as we get into this, I'm sure a lot of this will come up. So just to get us started here, again, I appreciate your time. We'll be going for the full hour today. And then just to kind of go through the agenda and our speakers, we're going to start with order of operations, which is really talking about, how does this all play out? And when you're actually getting started, whether you're a net new lab, you don't have a license or a place to operate, or if you're an existing lab that's trying to expand into solventless, we're going to be talking about how you can leverage solventless concentrates in either situation and generally what you can expect procedurally to successfully execute that. And then we're also going to be talking about lab planning, really what your lab might need, what it might not, and especially construction considerations, because there are some, really pro-level tips and tricks that are easy to miss if this isn't something that you've done before that can make an enormous impact on your future profitability and how your operation is running efficiently down the road. Some really small things early on can make a huge difference in the end. And then finally, we're going to wrap up with how to make informed decisions and really talking about some of the big common mistakes that we see happen time and time again with a lot of our clients. Unfortunately, Allie is not with us today. I just want to give her a big shout out and thank you for helping me get a lot of this content together. Unfortunately, she is dealing with a family emergency, but I'm really happy to present this to you guys, even though unfortunately she won't be joining us. So nothing is going to be missed. And we've spent quite a bit of time preparing and making sure that everything here is whole to make sure you guys are getting your time's worth. So just a quick bit on how to maximize this presentation. don't worry about remembering every detail. We're going to be recording this, and we can get that sent to everyone who's here after the fact. Make sure to take notes on the categories that you want to follow up on or need to research. But because there's going to be a lot of questions that I'm actually going to be asking you to consider, don't really worry about writing every single thing down. Otherwise, you're going to get lost as I'm moving through. But definitely write down your questions. I really would love to answer any of the questions that come through. And if we can't get through all of the questions, please make sure to email us at team@purecannalabs.com so we can talk about your specific scenario and your business's specific needs. We are here to help. And then a big part is zeroing in on your team's weaknesses. It's likely that you're going to have someone or some people on your team that have the necessary skills to pull off bringing your solventless lab to life, but there's a good chance that you don't have every single skill or every single person on your team. So wherever you might identify gaps in your team or your team's skill set, make sure to pay special attention to the parts of this presentation that are the least familiar so that you can get the most bang for your buck with your time here. So without further delay, let's get into it. So like I said, there's going to be a lot of questions that I'm actually going to be asking you guys this time, and I would really encourage everyone to think about these questions critically as we go through the presentation and thinking about which ones you don't know the answers to. So to get us started here and to really frame this presentation, it's super important that you and your team have some really clear answers up front about all of these questions, and I'm going to go through them. And for what you do not have clear answers for, make sure to think critically about why you don't have them, and just like I was saying in that last slide, who you might have on your team that could help with some of this, who you don't, what kind of consulting you might need to get some answers to these questions, because that is going to make a major difference in your ability to move efficiently towards having a solventless lab. So what are your long-term brand aspirations, and what kind of market footprint is necessary to achieve them? If you're trying to make a boutique brand and really be more mom and pop, you don't need to have the biggest lab in the world, and you don't need to have a whole warehouse full of equipment to achieve your output goals. But if you're trying to become a multi-state operator, or if you already are a multi-state operator and you're trying to install solventless in various markets, it's really important to understand what your long-term brand aspirations are. And we're going to spend a good bit of time talking about expansion and how to think about the phases of your business. But this is often forgotten early on, tying the brand together and where you want your brand to go with what you're going to try and achieve in the market and how this all plays into starting your solventless processing operation. And then how much are you planning to process in a given week, month, or year? And does the license that you seek limit your processing capacity? In certain states and locations, getting a microprocessing license might only entitle you to being able to produce a certain amount, which is going to have a huge impact on how much space that you need, what equipment you need, and what products you can ultimately make. Now, in many places, there aren't caps on certain kinds of licenses or the licenses that they offer in general, but trying to have an idea of how much you plan to process is really important early on so that you can actually make some decisions about what pieces of equipment you need and really how much space you're going to need to be able to move through your material. And then are you planning to construct a new building, or are you looking for space to lease? There's really pros and cons to each. When you're constructing a new building, it gives you a lot more latitude so that you can set it up exactly the way that you want it. But at the same time, new construction can be very expensive, especially now with the cost of building materials and everything that's going on with the economy. Whereas if you're looking to, lease a space, that can save you a lot of money up front, but it also can mean that you still need to spend time constructing within that space to make sure that it's up to code. And sometimes you're at the whim of your landlord. Typically a 5 or a 10-year lease is common, but if you're signing a lease, just really make sure that you have enough room to expand and that you have a landlord or owner of that building that's going to enable you to keep growing your business, that they don't have plans to sell that building anytime soon, because you're going to spend a lot of time and money getting it just right for the state or the municipality. Do you have an expansion plan that clearly lays out your possible growth phases? And if not, why? The next slide, we're going to spend a lot of time going over growth and thinking about the phases of your business, because a lot of time and energy goes into just getting that license, just getting the lights on, that sometimes that future growth isn't really carefully considered at the beginning, even if it's fairly theoretical. So this is something that we're going to spend a lot of time talking about. And then what is the location you tend to operate charge for the license you're planning to get? It's extremely variable from state by state. Here in America, in Canada, it's a little bit more flattened out, but there's all kinds of different complexities between the different kinds of licenses. And while that isn't completely germane to what we're going to be talking about today, there could be, hours and hours and hours spent on that topic. It's really important to understand what your location and what your license will enable you to do and what it's going to cost. So what we really like to start with our clients and just having people become successful with solventless and doing their lab planning is phase-based thinking. And even though you're not going to have the answer to every single question here, you really need to ask yourself and your team, what does your 5-year plan look like? Even though as you get further into the future, it can be fairly opaque, it's good to at least have a plan put in place for each one of these phases. Now, the median manufacturing facility build-out cost is around $570,000 US, according to the 2020 MJ Biz Factbook. But there's a pretty big range there, from $288,000 to $2 million or sometimes more. So depending on what kinds of processing you intend to do, if you're just going to do solventless, it tends to be on the lower end of that range. If you're doing solventless in addition to hydrocarbon and ethanol and you're going full bore, you're probably going to be on the higher end there. So when you've got such large investments taking place, it's really critical to plan for future growth from day one. And even though this is extremely flexible and maybe you might have 2 phases or 4 phases or whatever works for your business and your team, we tend to fall somewhere in the middle and encourage people to think about it in these 3 sorts of phases. If you're an existing lab and you have space that you're planning to either add solventless into, this whole process tends to go much quicker. You might already have a processing license. You just need to get equipment, make sure you have everything set up. So for the brands and attendees that are checking this out, that you already have some existing space, you're going to have to apply a little bit of a smaller lens here, because this is all going to come to life a lot more quickly. So typically in phase 1, what you tend to see is, executing your business plan, getting construction going, installing your equipment, making sure that you have your material available, whether or not you're cultivating or purchasing it or both. We find that many brands do both, but some of the brands that are able to have relationships with growers, whether it's a great relationship with their own growers in their own cultivation facility or other growers in their location, building that material pipeline is so critical to solventless, so that can't be overlooked. And then, really figuring out what are your first SKUs and your package designs, as well as introductory marketing efforts. These 2 portions tend to be overlooked early on because the complexity of acquiring a license tends to be so burdensome. I mean, in a lot of places, we might as well be refining uranium when you're trying to get cannabis licensing off the ground. So a lot of the marketing and what products you tend to make early on are often overlooked, but definitely take the time and energy to figure that out. Is your brand focused on edibles and dabbable concentrates, or are you going after topicals and edibles? It really depends on what kind of consumer you're trying to reach, but these are really important questions to figure out in phase 1. Now, once you turn the lights on and things get going, years 2 and 3, or whatever time frame this is for your business, phase 2 is really refinement. And again, thinking about your phase-based planning, this is where you're improving your process efficiency, increasing volume, really dialing in your existing SKUs, probably launching additional SKUs, and then really what we'd suggest is doubling down on your marketing efforts. This is, again, often overlooked by a lot of brands and businesses, and it's something that I'm personally passionate about, but it is a blind spot that I see at a lot of brands and businesses in the cannabis space. And then really refining your material cultivation or sourcing. The best material possible is going to make or break the quality of your solventless products, especially for dabbable concentrates. So just continuing to try and find or cultivate better and better cannabis. And then as you get into the later phases of your business's expansion, phase 3, phase 4, however that works out for you, and these things do take years, often businesses are adding equipment and additional manufacturing capabilities. They might be looking to double their output. They're increasing their staff. Do you have enough break rooms to handle that? Do you have lockers for everyone? And these are all things we're going to talk about soon. But when you're looking at the differences between what you need for phase 1 and phase 3, they're pretty considerable, which is why doing adequate planning for future expansion is so important early on, even if you don't have all of the answers. That last bullet point under phase 3 is what a lot of brands end up doing if they're successful, which is, hunting for even more expansion opportunities. Are they going into different states? Are they white labeling? Are they going to be licensing out their brand? There's even some cannabis businesses that are starting to franchise now. So there is a lot to consider. So just as a quick note, I just don't want anyone who's tuned in here to really underestimate what every state, municipality, or province, what they're going to require for their rules and regulations. So never make assumptions about building codes, laws, or what licenses confer to their owners. This is so important. Make sure that your team reads the fine print, consult experts, and apply what you learn here to your business's specific situation, because you might have different rules from city to city in the same state. This happens in Colorado. And then especially in some of the newer markets, just because you've done it before doesn't mean that it's going to be super straightforward doing it again in a new market or in a new location. So I can't stress that enough. So now we're going to spend the next 3 slides talking really about what your general order of operations are. Now, some of these things are going to be happening at the same time, so I would just encourage everyone to think openly and flexibly about how these steps come together and play out, because again, some of them are going to be happening simultaneously. But for the purposes of our presentation and with the time that we have, these have been laid out in pretty step-by-step order, so that it can be easier to be made sense of. So, first and foremost, it tends to be so obvious, but, what's your budget? And taking those phased rollouts, those phased expansions into account with everything else. Your investors might be willing to give you one sum of money to get off the ground, but have you talked to them about what expansion looks like? Do you know how much capital you have to work with ultimately? And do you have lines of credit if you overspend? Especially with construction, it's great. You're going to have a lot of costs figured out, but things are going to change. Costs for construction materials and contract labor is in such tight demand in so many places right now that having a budget that can be a little bit flexible tends to be a good idea right now. And again, does your budget account for future growth? And then because number 1, number 2, and number 3, and as we get to the next slide, even number 4 tend to all be happening simultaneously, or at least sort of in this order. Your business plan is going to be your next big thing when it comes to determining, what kind of SKUs are you planning to sell? Do you want to make a super high-end dabbable concentrates brand and take on some of the existing companies out there? Or are you looking to go more towards your lay consumers with topicals and edibles? Or are you just trying to do all of the above? Thinking critically about what solventless SKUs you want to sell has a huge impact on what kinds of material you need to source, what kinds of equipment you need. If you're not doing edibles, and you never plan to, you don't need a kitchen and you don't need to make gummies or chocolates or anything like that. but a lot of companies are going in that direction. So even if you're not sure what SKUs you're going to make, it's better to be a little bit more liberal with what you might plan to do with your space than being constrictive. How much volume do you intend to process? We already touched on this a little bit, but this is really important too. What's your ramp-up period? A lot of brands, you're not going to be operating at max capacity day one. You still have so much to figure out. There's so many kinks, there's so many little things to get your processes down that you might be only processing 10 to 25% of what you ultimately plan to right when you get started. But over the course of the first couple months, the first year, you should have a full ramp-up period lined up so that you can get up to 100% capacity with your equipment and your space. And then how well do you understand your market? Who are you going after? What does that volume look like in your state or your area? And what are the existing players that you're going to be competing against? And then once you start getting through some of these things, especially 1 and 2, that's where your facility design is really going to come into play, because if you're trying to disrupt the entire market in a mature area, well, chances are you're going to need a lot of space and a lot of equipment, a really great marketing plan, great investors. There's a lot that plays into this, and the V1 of your facility design is important to hone in on here, because your facility design is going to go through a few iterations. It's almost guaranteed. So some commonly overlooked things, does your floor plan account for a break room, extra storage, and office space? You might have nailed down your extraction lab really well, and we're going to talk about the specifics for solventless here soon, but are you also thinking about storage? Are you thinking about a place where your employees can make coffee for themselves or take a break? Sometimes these are overlooked. And then these last 2 questions here, is your plumbing adequate and is your water line big enough? Chances are you're going to need quite a bit of water to run your ice water hash system. This is very common, and what we've heard some horror stories of places that have, bought a building or they've bought land and they're constructing, and they go with a standard water line, which could be 1/4 of an inch, 1/2 an inch, and that might not have the gallons per day that they need to fill their RO tanks to keep up with their wash needs, because you need water for washing ice water hash, you need RO ice, you need water to clean things. There's a lot of water needs in a solventless extraction lab, and while some water reclamation is starting to come into focus for some of these brands, having too small of a water line can be a big disaster that's extremely difficult and expensive to fix retroactively. So moving through, number 3 on the last slide and number 4 here tend to be tied together very closely. I just couldn't get them to fit on the same slide super duper well without condensing everything down. So, hiring your architects and engineers, whether those are people that are already on your team or if you're working with consultants, you really want to work with real experts, design and evaluate your facility plans. And if possible, working with architects or engineers that are familiar with the nuances of cannabis processing. That can go a long way. And even though chances are they're not going to give you the price that you're looking for, and they're probably going to charge quite a bit, making sure that your plans for your facility designs and hiring the right people early can make such a big difference down the road, because like I was saying, retroactive changes to your facility plan, moving walls, moving equipment, this gets very expensive, and it's often right before you're trying to get your license, and it can be extremely frustrating. So are you providing the right data to your engineers about your utilities? Are you being realistic with your water needs, your electricity needs? Are you being realistic about your compressed air? And does your facility plan to have room down the road to expand? Are you really looking to actually have a serious expansion plan, or are you planning to stay small for a while? Do you have extra space to grow into, and are they helping you make sure that that space is available? Now, once you've got all this together and you're getting ready to submit this to the city, chances are your original plan is going to have some changes. That's why it's revisions round 1. You're going to have some changes based to the original plan, based on building codes or other requirements from the city. And it's really important to ask, what are you willing to compromise on? If you don't have as much space as you were hoping to, what is important to you and what is important to your business? Are you willing to have a smaller kitchen to make edibles, even if it's not the perfect size? That's okay. You need to decide what you are actually going, what hill are you going to die on to make sure that your lab gets off the ground? That's important. And then does your original budget have enough to cover the plan as it stands now? And unfortunately, I got cut off just a little bit there at the bottom. But, have you gotten any preliminary reviews from the city or conducted a pre-application meeting? In a lot of places, the city wants to talk to you early on because they want to make sure that you're a good applicant, that you know what you're doing, and that you're going to be bringing plans to them that seem to be in line with what their requirements are. So I can't stress that enough. Having a pre-application or a pre-planning meeting with the city, if you haven't already, can be a really, really good idea. And then once you've got all of this together, you've been spending months and months and months and lots of money making sure that you've got everything ready to submit. It's really time to put together your SOPs and submit everything to the city for review. Now, it can be tricky to have SOPs before you've ever made rosin or ice water hash. And that's something that we can absolutely help with, but that when it comes to figuring out your SOPs, it's really important to stress that are they unique to your facility and are they detailed enough? They will change over time, but typically the city is going to require SOPs of some dimension for you to be able to get your license one way or another. And have you had your application reviewed by someone who's in the know or a consultant in your area? And do they think that it's competitive? In every state, you're going to find that there's some nuances to what they think is competitive and what they don't, depending on what they're looking for. And then do you have a timeline of how long it's going to take to get licensed post-application? Are your investors expecting 6 months? Are they expecting a year? Are they willing to give you some extra time? Often it takes longer than people expect, depending on what their situation is. So baking some extra time into your timeline can really go a long way for your investors and for just everyone's stress levels. And then our final 3 here for our order of operations are, really revisions round 2. And sometimes we see people do it perfectly, but chances are you're going to have some changes that you have to make, that you're going to finalize with the city and make sure that you're ready to get your license. So, did you miss any code requirements? And if so, why? Who missed it? And why did they miss it? That's important to know now, because in order to remain compliant as time goes on, you really need to make sure that you are keeping it to code across the board. And have your goals changed or has the market shifted? Maybe you've been at this for a year. Has anything changed, and can you pivot in any direction then? And do you have any budgetary or regulatory licensing requirement changes? This isn't as common, but if your budget grows and you want to add more things, or if it shrinks a little bit and you need to pull back, it's good to be mindful of that. And then even though number 8, construction really is the big kahuna here, after you have those conditional use permits or you have permits to break ground, this is often the longest stage to complete. And it's really important, who is going to be managing your construction, and is someone going to be on site making sure that progress is actually happening? As anyone who has either worked in construction or even had their bathroom remodeled, what you're going to find is that it might not be happening all day, every day. And sometimes you really need to stay on top of your contractors and making sure that they're trying to keep to your timeline. And if they're not, that they need to be telling you why not. Why are there delays? This is very common. Having someone on site can make a huge difference. And do you have backup contractors? Sometimes contractors just pull out or they're not doing a good job and you have to fire them. Maybe your electrician is just dragging and you need to find somebody else. Do you have any backup contractors to make sure that you're not sitting on your hands for a plumber who's not available for 2 months to come get started? It's good to have contingency plans across the board for your construction. And then with final approval, once your construction is done, your equipment's installed, a final walkthrough is going to happen, and it's really important that you have your equipment installed properly and that it's ready to be operational. This is so commonly overlooked. And do all of your utilities connect and work as they should? Have you been working with the city to make sure that your utilities are ready to turn on for that final walkthrough to get your license? And then do you have any outstanding requirements the city or state has requested? Every city is different, and all of these city and town planners are going to have different things that they're looking for. So make sure that you're talking with them pretty much constantly so that when you get to that final approval stage, nothing comes up and surprises you, because nothing is worse than thinking that your license and being able to become operational is imminent, but then you miss something or you didn't have a conversation with them. And then that regulator that was going to come do your final walkthrough isn't available for another month or two. This is something that we've heard happen numerous times. So just really crossing your T's and dotting your I's before that final approval walkthrough is going to make everyone so much happier. So just to shift gears a little bit, got a couple things here to be very mindful of, and this is for really any extraction lab, but with the RO water required specifically for solventless. Whoever you're working with, make sure that they understand international building codes inside and out. And IBC is huge. Any architect, any engineer in the construction space worth their salt is going to be all over this. But if you get the hunch that they're not, you should probably find some new consultants, because you might get pretty far down the road and then find out that they missed something. Is a door supposed to open in? Oh, maybe it was supposed to open out. Comparing IBC codes with your city requirements, they should be able to do both. And if you aren't feeling confident there, don't go too far down the road without finding people that you do feel confident in. And then, good manufacturing practices as it relates to your equipment. Does the equipment that you're purchasing conform to GMP standards, or is it capable? And for anyone here who's in Canada, it absolutely has to. It's a little bit of a mixed bag in the United States, but make sure the company that you're buying your machinery from is knowledgeable about GMP, knowledgeable about the electrical safety requirements in your area, in calibration. For our customers in Los Angeles, they have really onerous requirements compared to someone in Oklahoma. And then in Canada, they're even more strict about it. And then finally here, RO water is absolutely required. You really need RO water to make ice water hash properly, and you also need it for your ice makers. And the filtration itself isn't expensive. RO filters, even pretty high volume ones, aren't terribly expensive, but it does take time. And having an area in your facility to store that RO water, which feeds into your production and your ice maker, is absolutely essential. For some of the higher volume labs, they might have a 1,500 or a 2,000 gallon tank, or maybe even more. So don't just plan to have your water line feed the water that you need, because chances are it won't be able to keep up. What is much more common is that businesses are going to have RO water tanks. The water's already been filtered, it's sitting there. Ideally, it's chilled and it's ready to go for your wash. So just make sure that you're paying really close attention to your water needs, like we were talking about with your water lines, your storage, and making sure that it's all RO filtered and ideally chilled. Cool. So when it comes to the actual solventless lab space, I think this is something that a lot of you have probably been waiting for in this presentation. But I just want to make a quick note here that, these are approximations, and they're really meant to be pretty general. This is not an exact architectural requirement, but this is where we tend to see most of the labs that we're talking to. These are the buckets that they fall into. So it's important to take what your aspirations are for your solventless processing and see which one of these it might fit into. So a lot of brands are in that boutique space, and what we really like to stress is that, if you only have 500 square feet to work with, you can absolutely get solventless going, but that really is the bare minimum to have a small operation get off the ground. And we really suggest having space closer to 1,000 feet, if at all possible, if you're constrained on space or if this is just going to be a small part of your business, because that gives you some room for expansion and just for quality of life for your employees to avoid being especially cramped. Now, I've personally seen solventless operations that make some of the best hash you've literally ever seen. They're almost doing it in a closet. But if you have the ability to give your team more space, you really should, because it's going to allow you to expand a little bit too. Now, mid-size is also extremely common. This is probably where most of the labs that we talk to tend to fall in. But, you're looking at these approximate processing ranges It's pretty variable, and that really all comes down to your equipment and what's available to you. But having some extra space, especially on the higher end of that range, maybe closer to 2,000 square feet, that really gives you a lot more latitude. You can scale more quickly. You can produce multiple SKUs that are solventless early. You have extra space to add things. You have extra space for storage. You might be doing your packaging right there. For a lot of businesses, if they're not trying to be super high output and they're just getting started, but they don't want to be completely cramped, this mid-size range tends to give them a lot of opportunity to really grow their solventless division as time goes on, even if they're only using part of that space at the beginning. And then really the high output labs, these are some of the biggest labs that we talk to and that are out there, although pretty soon we're going to start seeing ultra high output labs that are, north of that 3,000 to 4,000 square foot range. But just getting solventless started, chances are you really don't need a ton more space than this. This gives you a ton of opportunity to really have multiple cold rooms, and this is really for businesses that are well capitalized and they're looking to compete on price and volume by, gaining efficiencies that smaller labs are going to struggle to create. And really, if you do have a lot of extra room or you're really trying to be a solventless focused business, having extra room to expand, especially into edibles and tinctures and topicals, and just being able to diversify your SKU lineup as time goes on, having this extra space can make a huge difference down the road. But again, not every brand, not every business has this option or this capital, but this tends to be the high range of what we see. So here is a super important part of this presentation and something that has been the subject of some debate until recently. But if you're trying to make a premium dabbable concentrate of live rosin, ice water hash, full melt, you really need to have a cold room. But there's some nuances to having a cold room that, if you're aware of them early on in construction, can make a huge difference for your business. So, having a room that can be cooled below 55 degrees really is the gold standard. Some places do walk-in freezers, but that can be pretty punishing when it comes to the conditions that your workers are actually operating in. So traditional cold rooms aren't cheap, but chances are you aren't going to be washing 24 hours a day, 7 days a week with night shifts. You really want to get a custom washroom built, a cold room, so that it can cool down before and while you're washing, but run at normal temperatures when you aren't, to save on utility costs, because a lot of electricity is required to run these coolers and keep these spaces. In this image, this is a pretty gigantic cold room. You're going to find that you really don't want to put any equipment that uses a heat exchanger in your chilled room, such as your freezers, ice machines, refrigerators, or your rosin presses, because that means that your cold room and your chillers have to work that much harder to keep it cool, because they're combating that heat exchange. So make sure to put a lot of this other equipment that has heat exchange elements outside of your cold room. That's so important. And then make sure to design it so that the ceiling is only as high as it has to be, because if you've got a 10 or a 12-foot cold room and 2 or 3 of those feet are just up above everyone's heads, not being used for really anything, well, over the course of months and years, your business is going to be spending a lot of money to cool airspace that isn't being used for anything. So we're going to talk about this at the very end, really how to be mindful of ceiling height, especially when it comes to your cold room. But while you do need ample square footage in your space plan to account for your cold room, and there's a reason it says cold rooms at the top, because often brands also have a cold room for their packaging, or they do some of their packaging in their washroom for full melt and things like that. But just make sure that the ceiling isn't too high for what kind of washing system you're going to use, especially if you're using gravity draining. That's where things can get a little tricky, but we're going to talk about that too. So we've got a couple other considerations here, and unfortunately it looks like on my end it did get a little cut off at the bottom there, but that noise is a big one. And when it comes to your air compressor, virtually all extraction labs, whether you're doing solventless exclusively, but especially solvent and solventless, you need an air compressor to run various things. Now, air compressors, depending on how much output you need, can be quite noisy. There are some very nice high-end ones like the rotary screw air compressors that tend to be quite a bit quieter. They are more expensive. There are smaller ones that are quieter, but they don't tend to have the output that you need. So being mindful of the noise that an air compressor makes is really, really important. In this image, we just have a Quincy QT54. This is a really high output, affordable air compressor, a couple $1,000s, but man, they are so loud. And you really do not want to have one of those right in your rosin pressing room or in an area that people are spending all day in, because that really wears on people. So having air compressors, either in a separate room, in a closet, or if possible outside, and routing those air lines into the lab is going to add a lot for employee comfort and just for everyone's sanity. Now, when you're talking with your engineers and you're figuring out your utility costs and really what you need for your compressed air, just be mindful of the fact that compressed air lines can only keep air compressed up to a certain distance. So that is something that your engineers can help you out with. But if you need 140 PSI in your rosin pressing room to run your pneumatic rosin press, but your air compressor is, 300 feet away, that might not work. So just make sure to really consult with your engineers and your architects about, what would be an optimal place for your air compressor to be, and then how long can those lines run to remain under optimal pressure. And then storage and packaging. Adequate storage is not usually accounted for in a solventless lab. And if you have an existing lab space where all of your packaging and your storage is being handled, then this part of it probably isn't going to apply to you. But if you need to store a lot of fresh frozen for washing because you are either purchasing a lot of material or you need to store what you're growing over time, where are your freezers going to go? And how are you going to store your rosin and your ice water hash in general? So storage is something that a lot of brands that are new aren't really thinking about. How many shelves do you need to store all your containers and boxes? You're going to have all kinds of containers like in this image here, and then the boxes for those, and then all your metric tags. There's a lot more storage that goes into cannabis concentrates than a lot of people bargain for when they're new to it. And just really to make sure to allot enough space to accommodate all of that. And again, this is really just to avoid having an overly cramped lab. You're going to have happier employees and a more efficient operation if people aren't stepping over each other all day, every day, just to do their job. Oh, well, it looks like, unfortunately, our last slide was not put in here, but I'm just going to go over a couple things that are some common mistakes that we tend to see. And when we send this out to you, we'll make sure that everyone gets the full copy of this presentation, including that slide. So some common mistakes that we tend to see, I'm just going to grab my notes right here. Equipment selection is something that people tend to think about very late in the process. If you don't have your equipment lined up really early on and you're scrambling to get it ordered and installed so that you can get your final walkthrough, that might not go well, especially on the time, depending on the time of the year. So for us, our lead times increase a little bit when it comes to Croptober because so many brands and businesses are trying to get rosin presses and ice water hash equipment in the door. So if you're scrambling to get that and it's right around Croptober, it's going to be a little harder. So just make sure that you have your equipment list lined up as early as possible. That is something that we see a lot of brands really overlooking. And then poor size planning is something we also see a lot of new brands and new businesses getting into solventless not really nail on the first try. Getting your size planning right isn't just critical for the initial build out, but also scaling. And as you've heard, I've said this over and over and over, but thinking about that phase-based planning, sizing your equipment appropriately, making sure you have some room to expand, and really considering what kind of equipment you want for that future expansion. If you can go up one size and it's going to cost you a little bit of money now, but it's going to change and not require you to buy a second one of that piece of equipment, down the road, that's probably a good move. Freezer storage is something we see people overlook when it comes to their pour size planning. We were just talking about that a little bit. Really plan for your worst case scenario. If you're expecting bi-weekly deliveries of material, but your vendor changes and you move to monthly deliveries, you want to be able to accommodate and adjust for that because you're going to need more freezer space. Ceiling height is the second to last one here in the common mistakes category. We really see a lot of low ceiling height issues with hash washing equipment and freezer storage. If you're planning to do hand washing and gravity draining, chances are you're going to require higher ceilings. But now with advancements with our pneumatics hash pump, you don't need to have a high ceiling to do hand washing. But if you are planning to do gravity draining, you are going to need a higher ceiling because someone's going to be standing on a step stool, and your cold room needs to account for that. And then, air compressors can add height to, your areas as well, just depending on where they are. Some air compressors can be quite large. Sometimes people run them remotely on their roof if it's available, but that can be expensive too. So cold rooms with really high ceilings, we talked about that, just, having that extra capacity where you don't really want to spend all that money cooling that air. And then last, but certainly not least, one of the other biggest common mistakes that we see is really underestimating solvent-based processing. So if you are doing solventless and solvent-based processing and you're a new business, you should treat them as separate projects. The architectural requirements, venting, C1D1 blast-proof rooms, all of these things are a lot more challenging and tend to be more expensive for doing solvent-based processing as opposed to solventless. So really underestimating solvent-based processing in addition to solventless is something we see a lot of companies that we work with that are new trip and stumble over. With solventless, you're really going to run into a lot less safety restrictions and hazards. The zoning is easier. The material is in and out. The waste considerations are much more simple. So just really treat them as separate projects. If you're doing solvent-based processing too, they should be running separately in a lot of important ways. So really don't underestimate that. So here's our list. Thanks for getting that in there. I appreciate that. We've gone through pretty much all of the material here, and we've got a little bit of time left, so I'd love to get through some questions. Megan, I'm going to pass this back to you. So thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much for such an informative presentation, Eric. Before we get started on the question and answer session, I would like to remind our audience how to submit questions. You can submit questions by typing them in the Q&A box, which can be found on the right-hand side of the presentation window. Our first question is, how much does equipment tend to run for solventless labs?
Yeah, great question. It really comes down to the size of your operation and what your processing requirements are going to be. But, a really small boutique lab can get off the ground for anywhere from, $30,000 or more, depending on if you need sinks and tables. It can grow from there. Whereas if you're a much larger lab and you're really looking to be aggressive and build out a large facility like those high output labs, you might be closer to that $150,000, sometimes even, $200,000 range. But all in, the equipment costs tend to be considerably less than solvent-based processing because when you take into account the architectural requirements, not needing that C1D1 room, not needing that expensive and specialized ventilation, overall your equipment costs are going to be quite a bit less than what you're used to seeing for solvent-based processing. But it does vary, and that's something that we can, help you spec out.
Do you guys offer training on how to make solventless SKUs?
Yes. So great question. So we have two businesses. Pure Pressure really is the equipment manufacturer, and then our sister business, Pure Labs, is the training and consulting end of the equation. So we do offer in-person, video, all kinds of different training options, as well as pre-made SOPs that can then be fitted to your lab's specific needs. So Pure Labs, we work with clients all across the country in North America and wherever legal markets operate, including, as far abroad as New Zealand. So we're really familiar with, everything from GMP to also international requirements for processing. But getting some training early on, if you don't have a skilled hash maker on staff, can really make a huge difference to expedite your SKU production so that you can start making some more of those advanced SKUs quite a bit earlier, as opposed to doing all of the R&D yourself. And you've got brands out there that have been doing this for years and years. So really leapfrogging that early R&D period and getting training can make a big difference for your profitability.
Are all of your apparatus/equipment integrated to achieve end-to-end data capture and formulation manipulations, which are great for regulations and legislation?
Yeah, really good question. There's a lot tied up in that. So the short answer is somewhat. When it comes to data capture, not all of it is automated, but that is stuff that we are thinking about and actively working on. That's something that we really help a lot of our customers with too, is just how to, set up a pro forma, for example, so that, from the very beginning of your business plan, all the way through really understanding, what your yields are, inputs, outputs, and being able to take your data and turn it into something useful. When it comes to your formulations and manipulating them, that tends to be, in some cases, as much of an art as it is a science. And when it comes to solventless, it really is more of the artisan end of the spectrum when it comes to making these products. That's why they tend to command such high price points in the market. So the short answer is, we really are working on this. We do not have the ability to automatically capture every single bit of data with our equipment yet, but you can create recipes not only for making ice water hash, but also for making rosin, so that once you really dial in your formulations, that you can repeat them and have an operator who doesn't necessarily have to be your lead hash maker or the most skilled person on your hash making team, getting the same results over and over and over. So those recipes really, really make a difference. Hopefully that answers your question, but if you've got some more questions after the fact, we'd love to dive into some details with our engineering team.
Can you speak on solventless extraction in newer markets where biomass is scarce and expensive?
Yeah, that is a good one. We've really seen a lot of markets go through this because, as markets mature, they need to figure out how to grow high quality enough cannabis to make these high-end dabbable concentrates. Now, what we usually suggest is that if material is a little bit scarce or very scarce, depending on, what market you're in, it depends on if you're cultivating yourself or not. If you have your own cultivation as a part of your business or your licenses, that is something that your grower, you can work with them on, finding the right genetics, doing the right soil types, or if you're doing hydroponics or whatever, making sure that you're really focused on having solventless-specific genetics. Or if you're buying your material, working with the growers to make sure that, hey, are you guys growing for dried flower or are you guys growing for resin? And a lot of the really high-end growers in California and Oregon, Colorado, some of these more mature markets, they're really focused on resin. So to tie this all back to your real question, if all of that sounds really nice, but you don't really have a ton of options there, you can absolutely make solventless products. Not as well the dabbable ones, but topicals, edibles, tinctures, the actual quality of cannabis that those require. Now, it can't have powder mildew or mold. Solventless isn't going to remediate what you might call bad material, but you don't need to have a true dabbable level resin to make some of these great food grade types of oils which go into those products. So we really suggest that if you're in a newer market and you can't get your hands on some top quality cannabis, it's a great idea to dial in some of your other solventless processes first, like making edibles or topicals or tinctures. And then as more high quality material becomes available, that's when you can really start breaking into some of those top shelf dabbable concentrates, live rosin, full melt, rosin cartridges, and things like that.
I think we have time for one more question. What's the best practice for prepping the plant material prior to freezing?
Yeah, that's another good one. When it comes to getting your buds ready to be frozen and then ultimately washed into ice water hash, it's a pretty simple process, but it has a couple steps. And first and foremost, you really need to defan your plants, and you're really trying to strip away anything that doesn't have sugar or trichomes on it. So stripping away those fan leaves. Some places will do kind of a light trim on the non-sugar leaves that aren't quite fan leaves, but then it's really breaking it down into manageable bud chunks that can then be put into bags and then frozen. So a light touch is really important there. You don't want to over-process it, over-trim it. The whole point is to have some efficiency by not having to trim your plants. And in doing fresh frozen, it's also really helpful that, you don't want to have bricks of buds that are all mashed together, because then when you go to actually break them up and try and wash them, that is going to be really challenging for your washers because they need to get in the middle of those. So having your buds not be densely packed in your freezer bags is going to make a huge difference. Just having them be loosely placed in there when they're being frozen so that when they come out of the bag, it's not just, sponge cake. You want individual buds to be able to come out even though they're frozen. So we've got some really good blogs on the Pure Cannalabs website, one in particular, and then some on Pure Pressure. I think we've got another one that's coming out pretty soon here on this exact topic. So we have some good educational information offline here that we can provide to you. So thank you for your question. And fresh frozen is really essential to make a high quality live rosin. So I'm glad that you're thinking about that.
Great, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I want to thank the audience for attending and for participating in today's event. I would also like to thank our sponsor, Pure Pressure, for making today's educational webcast possible.